Okay. Welcome, everyone. It's nice to see your smiling faces. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Dr. Tiffany White. I'm the Diversity Services Coordinator with the Department of Behavioral Health. I want to welcome our panelists today. I'm just going to give them a short intro, but when we get into the nitty-gritty, feel free to introduce yourselves, okay? So first, I'm going to go based on my screen on Zoom. We have Daryl Hamilton, who is a clinician and director of substance use disorder services from Kingsview. We have Atisha Wilbon. I'm sorry, Tisha. Who is the LMFT and vice president with Mental Health Systems. We have Yolanda Randalls, who is our executive director from West Fresno Family Resource Center. I was definitely guaranteeing to mess that up, so I had to say it super slow. And then we have Dr. Rochelle Thomas, who is the clinical psychologist and owner of Alley Psychological Services. Welcome, everyone. So we just want to go ahead and get right into it, and I want each of you to take a moment and say whatever you wanted to say as well. But our main question that we have today that we want to focus on is wellness, and we want to know what wellness means to you. So we'll go ahead and get started with Daryl.
First, let me say thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. It's an honor to be hanging out with everybody and the esteemed colleagues I get to share the stage with. So for me personally, wellness is effectively dealing with what's on my plate. Wellness to me is being at ease, not struggling, always looking to expand my knowledge, taking care of my body. So I don't know about any of you, but I've gained some, I call it COVID pounds. So I need to get rid of some COVID pounds. So I've been taking care of my body here lately. Also, understanding my purpose and being in tune with the one who gave me or assigned me my purpose is important to me. Being connected and available to others. And then on the job, gaining fulfillment in the lives that I'm able to come in contact with. All those things are important to me and part of my wellness plan.
Thank you, Daryl. It sounds like wellness is something that's holistic for you, so I appreciate that. We'll go ahead and go with Atisha next.
Hi, so I think for me, wellness, honestly, I think wellness looks different for a lot of us. But more specific to me is I like to look at it from the perspective of, is this something that's going to bring me joy? Is this something that's adding to my day-to-day life? I think that ideally we want to have that work-life balance. We want to be able to find a level of stability amongst those things, but that's not always the solution that we run into. And so I like to go from the perspective of joy because it just seems a lot more free-flowing. And if anyone's like me, I sometimes can get so overcritical of myself when I am looking at the perspective of work-life balance, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I wasn't able to do it this week. And once I took that part out of it and stopped looking at it as I have to balance this, I have to do this a specific way, I started to change my perspective of like, hey, I may not be perfect. I may not be able to hit that work-life balance, but is this something that's going to bring me joy? Am I taking care of myself? Is this something that has decreased my stress? Is this adding something positive to me? And being able to understand that what my wellness is going to look like isn't going to be identical to that of my peer, to that of my siblings, my parents, things along those lines, because we are the holder of our own things, essentially our self-care, and we determine what that looks like for us. There's no handbook. So if I go from the perspective of joy, I have a lot more control over what that looks like, and I'm able to explore different things of what's going to make me feel me and kind of keep me moving into the next steps.
Thank you, Atisha. And we'll get into it a little bit more in this panel discussion, but Atisha and I try to be wellness accountability partners sometimes. We're not always successful, Same with Daryl. I try to do check-ins, and I feel like a theme that we're going to hear is that all of the people in this panel discussion are very hardworking, and behavioral health is something that they center their entire lives towards. And practicing wellness every day may or may not be an ongoing thing that we have to remind ourselves of. And so with that being said, we'll go on to Yolanda. If you can tell us what wellness means to you.
Sure. Hi, thank you. And thank you again for allowing me to be a part of this great panel discussion. I want to think that this is probably the first time that this has been done in Fresno, so it's very exciting to be a part of this. So for me, I think about when someone says, "How are you doing today?" Right? And then normally our typical response, "I'm doing well. I'm doing okay." And so, but when I think about wellness and I think about me, and this is an opportunity to be selfish because we're always so giving, we're always so ready to help and give, either if you're a mom or a dad or a grandparent or director, doctor, we're always ready to give. But when I think about wellness for me, I think about a holistic approach. Like, is my mind clear? Am I physically fit? Am I emotionally, okay? And joy. Like, am I happy today? And then more importantly for me, spirituality is like extremely important, right? Did I give thanks today? For the little things, just for, waking up, this morning, for allowing myself to get up, get dressed, eat, get in my car, drive to work, just those small things, so that for me is important, for my wellness, for my well-being. I have to make sure that I am good, right, before that I am able to give out. And so all of those things, are extremely important for me in terms of wellness.
I definitely appreciate that take because I think that a lot of us forget that we are in airplane rules, right? We have to put the oxygen masks over ourselves before we can even think about helping anyone else. And so I think sometimes wellness can be seen, or self-care can be seen as something that's frivolous, where in reality it's radical self-preservation, right? So definitely appreciate that. We'll go ahead and go to Dr. Thomas. What does wellness mean to you?
Hi, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel. I'm really excited for today. And I just really, really appreciate it because, as Yolanda said, this is not done often, nearly often enough, and especially in the Black community. In terms of wellness, I'm gonna sound like the cavalry because everybody else said everything good. So I'm gonna sum it up. Because there's little bits and pieces from everybody's response that I really resonate with. So for me personally, wellness, joy comes to mind definitely, which is distinctly different than happiness. Because happiness is based on what happens to you. So joy I always describe as a general sense of okayness with life. So I measure my wellness, me personally, by how I'm doing when things are tough, actually. Do I still feel centered? Do I still feel okay? Do I still have a sense of joy that even though right now things don't feel good, that I'm going to be okay, it will be okay? And do I have the tools that I need to effectively navigate that situation, be it support or accountability partners, be it necessarily taking, time to myself, taking care of my physical health. And really even what Atisha said about balance, sometimes balance varies over the lifespan and it looks very different. So in the past, few weeks, my life has been perfectly lopsided and that I've been pursuing grant funding. But at the end of it, although I'm tired and fatigued, I have a sense of purpose, like Daryl said, and a sense of fulfillment. Try also, like Yolanda said, trying to be grateful for the opportunities, even when I'm in adverse situations. So that's how I measure my wellness.
Thank you so much. And I just want to kind of highlight what each of you really said, in that wellness isn't something that happens by accident, right? It's something that we have to prioritize. And I wonder, just because, well, in the spirit of Black History Month, and the part of the reason that we're doing this panel discussion is that we want to focus on African Americans and Black history. And so I wonder if you all think that wellness is different for members of the Black community. So we don't have to go in order. Anyone who wants to take a stab at that question is welcome to go.
So for me, I definitely think that while, like, I want to kind of preface it with, I think depending on the specific culture, it's always going to look different. I think more specifically from my own personal lived experience, when we talk about wellness, a lot of it and a lot of the things that come out of wellness is rooted in a lot of our transgenerational trauma that has led us to where we are today. And so there are things that I may not have directly experienced myself, but I am a product of the way that my grandmother coped with things and the trauma she experienced, my great-grandmother, my mother, and so forth. And so as it's passed down, we are learning these different versions of coping skills. I'm hesitant to call it wellness because sometimes these different coping skills that we're learning aren't 100% healthy. They are those defense mechanisms that have been rooted in us. And so over a period of time, it becomes the norm, because if I continue to do this, then this is going to keep me safe. And I'm going to pass this on to my children because this is going to keep them safe. And so I was having a great discussion with a peer, I want to say last week, when we were talking about the code switching panel, and as well as yesterday about the code switching panel, and saying that code switching was rooted in that racial discrimination. It was also rooted in a form of that Black wellness. And while it can hurt and help us at the exact same time, when we're looking at it from that perspective, it came out of being a defense mechanism. This is a stereotype of what people expect me to be. And so in order for me to move forward at the same level of someone that's not a person of color, I have to work 10 times as harder. I have to change the lingo, the African-American vernacular that I typically would engage in with my family members, because doing this in the work setting isn't always going to be welcomed. And so we have to take into consideration how we're going to be perceived. What stereotypes has this person placed on me unknowingly, unconsciously, without my permission? And so when I think about my wellness, I'm thinking about it like, hey, one thing is like, my mom may engage in a behavior that we see as her personal version of wellness, but it doesn't mean that it's healthy. And so we have to look at it from a different perspective of some of the wellness that we look into is transgenerational trauma and a response to it. And so when we approach it, we need to look at like, hey, did this serve a purpose in that moment? And does it still serve a purpose today? Is it functional in the way that we are moving within our current experiences? Because some things aren't. Times have changed, but we also have to acknowledge that racism is still here. And so with all of those different things here, it still has a level of functionality, maybe not as extreme as in different settings. But when we look at it, we have to remember that and say, it's like telling a client like, hey, that defense mechanism does not work. I need you to get rid of it. But if it's gotten them this far, right, what are we replacing it with? Right. How are we going to take something that has been so functional and so essential for them, yank it from them, and then say, all right, figure it out? We can't look at it that way. So we have to be strategic when we're talking about Black wellness, and we have to acknowledge where these unhealthy and healthy coping skills came from and their functionality, and also strategic about what we are putting in place of it, because sometimes it's not going to be realistic for that cultural experience.
Yeah, so you mentioned a lot of great things. I'm sorry, Dr. Thomas. I just wanted to kind of highlight what she said, in that we have transgenerational things that we may not have experienced personally, but it impacts us, right? And that comes off of this year where we've seen how many African Americans murdered in our media, and we're regularly getting these images of people who look like us, traumatized and brutalized, right? And so all of that has an impact on us. And like you said, when a service provider is working with someone, being very mindful of not blaming the person of using the coping skills, whether or not they're maladaptive or not, they've got them this far, right? So let's not blame them for their own oppression. So I just wanted to highlight that a bit. I'm sorry, Dr. Thomas. Go ahead.
No, you're fine. This is so good. I also really wanted to play off of that because we talk about intergenerational and transgenerational trauma. And there are two sides to that coin in terms of how we, build resilience and how we cope with community trauma. The best and worst thing about Black wellness is the sense of community.
Yeah.
Is a sense of community. This panel, how we're having this conversation is an extension of what Black wellness looks like. Because what do we do in situations like this? We pull together and we have conversations. So I think Atisha's really right. Looking at these transgenerational patterns, but also creating space to create new methods of coping is extremely, extremely important and worthwhile.
And I think the fact that we are acknowledging the coping skills, good or bad, right? Because and you're absolutely right, because that's what, like, I saw my mom do, right? And maybe that's how she saw her mom, right? And so it's just been passed down. But where and who, right, in the community is going to be able to help those individuals change, right? Change how they cope, and at the same time too, keep their identity, keep their their authentic way of who they are, right? Their Blackness, right? Because you don't want to say, oh, nah, that was wrong what Mama did,
Right.
But wait a minute, that's my mom, right? That was my strength, that was my solid, right? And then how do we replace that? How do we capture that and then replace it with something, good, right? That there's a balance, right? And our families, that's our Blackness, right? That's our strength, that's our rock, right? Within our family. So yeah, it's, you're right on. And I'm just over here nodding my head to this, you're right on in what you were saying, but the whole intergenerational and our kids, we in our agency, we deal with a lot of young people, in the Black community, and they are struggling, right now. They are struggling. And to have a place where they can go, right?
Resources or the lack of resources. And so for wellness, many of us have talked about spiritual connection, health connection, mind connection, mind and body. But we do know this. We know that there are plenty of churches in the Black community. But are there gyms? Are there bike trails? Is there entertainment? Are there healthy food options?
Right.
Are there opportunities for intellectual engagement? Are there employment opportunities? And so I would challenge people to look at the resources within the Black community and then look at the reviews of those resources. And could it be that some of those negative reviews have to do with the establishment not being in tune with the community itself? And so those are the things that I consider when looking at the Black community.
I think that's super insightful, and I don't know that that's something that I've ever considered on like an intentional level about how the Black and African American community is always paired with faith-based as a source of support, but that we don't have those other sources as easily accessible, and possibly because of the consequences of racism, right? So we have things like redlining, we have food deserts, we may or may not get access to a loan to create that gym. All of these different things are having direct impact on wellness, right? So thank you for that. That's super insightful.
And I just want to say quickly, that was very insightful, Dr. Hamilton, because I'm here in Southwest Fresno, right, 92706. And there are over 60 churches in this community,
Wow.
right? But when you look at, on the flip side of that, there's liquor stores, right? There's plenty of liquor stores in this community. There's maybe 2 community gyms, right, in this community. But green space and all those other items that you listed, yeah, they are lacking, in this community. And so when we talk about like development or economic opportunities, like all of that has an impact, on our communities.
And I think that Daryl brought up an amazing point when we talk about the resources, because we also have to take into consideration what the media portrays to us. And so a lot of times, what I noticed when I worked for the school district is a lot of kids that looked just like me weren't aware of the capacity that they had. They weren't aware of how far that they could go. So hearing from me, like, hey, I'm in college, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, they're like, oh, so we are actually have that ability to do that. And there's not easily accessible resources all of the time that gives us that little bit of hope, because most of the time when we're talking about that trauma that comes from generation after generation, there isn't that component to it, because most of them weren't allowed to seek out higher education. And so it's not an option. And a lot of times without those resources, we have no idea what options we have. And we have to look at the way that media portrays us when there's a movie that is primarily filled with African Americans, that's surrounding gang violence. It's surrounding primarily being in a faith-based location, things along those lines. There is a liquor store on every corner, but they're not talking about affordable, healthy food. We don't see gyms in the middle of a movie that's talking about being in Compton. So we are seeing what the quote unquote hood is looking like, but we're not seeing any actual resources in that area to support and essentially provide options to anyone that wants to seek out more for themselves.
I would agree, absolutely, especially on the resource piece. And, we talk about parks and green space and, gyms and other spaces for recreational activities to keep our bodies healthy. But even that, I live in the 06 zip code. I'm a proud resident of District 3. When I say proud, I mean proud. Sidewalks, forget the gym. If I don't, I should be able to walk out of my house and be able to walk safely to where I need to go, even if it's a block away. What if I don't have access to transportation? I at least want to be able to walk safely so I'm not stepping in a pothole, right. So I'm not seeing blight all over the place and places where illegal dumping takes place, which is a lot of the times not trash from District 3 residents, but that's a whole different discussion. But there are so many things that are labeled as amenities that really are just basic level resources that we should have, that we're entitled to. I walk miles and miles most days, just for my wellness. And when we look at obesity rates, when we look at how COVID has impacted our communities, well, we can see why, in addition to the food desert, but because we don't even have a place to take a 20-minute stroll. Right. And the stress that comes with that. It's just glaringly obvious why a lot of these even physical health disparities exist, which also impact and interplay with our mental health disparities as well.
Absolutely. And in the spirit of equity, we have to have that conversation, right? So we talk about health equity, we talk about equity in education, and we have to consider, we're holding kids to the same expectation of people who don't live in food deserts, who have someone driving them to school and work, And so when someone from our community walks on, they don't have sidewalks, they're walking past 5 liquor stores on their way. They may have had traumas on their way, didn't have breakfast that morning, or had hot Cheetos and a Mountain Dew for breakfast. I'm talking about my childhood. And we expect them to perform at the same standard as everyone else, right? And so that's where that trauma-informed perspective becomes so important in everything that we do.
Yeah, and not only that, Dr. Thomas, you were dead on. So folks that live here, I don't live here, I work here, my church is here, my kids went to school here in 1906, but the community, the sense of family, the sense of pride, that you have in this community is just, it's amazing to see if you have not
just go to an Edison High football game. Oh my goodness gracious. It is just, I mean, it's like really something to see the pride that the community has, you know, with the school. But when we talk about lack of resources, right? And so when we talk about community engagement, right? When the city is going through their planning and the county is doing their health thing, it's like, oh, we want to hear from the community. We want to know, you know, what the needs are, right? And when the community comes together and says, hey, we need green space, we need economic development, we need jobs, we need stuff for our kids, you know, and our kids are saying, no place to go, nothing to do, you know, here in this community. So they have all this time on their hands to do stuff that they should not be doing. So that engagement piece, right, and engaging our community I mean, folks are tired of surveys and focus groups and meetings when they don't see outcomes, right? When they don't see a change, you know, in their community, they become really frustrated, and it's really hard to try to get them to come to the next, you know, hey, we really need you here. We want to hear from your, you know, get your opinion on. But it's really frustrating when you don't see a real change, you know, in the community, and especially here in Southwest Fresno. And even though Fresno, the Black community, we're kind of like all over Fresno, but you still have a large portion of African Americans that live in 93706.
Right, and I just to add quickly, a lot of the time, one of the stereotypes is that Black is synonymous with poor. And that is not the case. You have plenty of people, professionals, entrepreneurs, doctors, attorneys, business owners who live in areas like the 06 zip code. It is not synonymous with poor. And you have a very strong tax base that comes out of the 06 zip code. So perhaps, and again, everybody has mentioned the funding and resources. If you can fund businesses from the 06 zip code, I should be able to establish and set up shop in the 06 zip code to keep the tax dollars flowing within that district so we can have more resources. I shouldn't have to go across town or out of the zip code just to set up shop. And people should be able to be walking distance within walking distance of their job. Viable employment opportunity. But if employers and entrepreneurs are not being funded and don't have access to resources, we'll continue to see, you know, a lack of resources and lack of wellness in our communities.
Absolutely, and thank you, Dr. Thomas, for making that point, because one of the things that we want to make very clear in this is that Black people are not a monolith, right? So if you are working with a person from the Black community, just ask them questions, use a whole person approach. You cannot make the assumption that they are living in poverty. In fact, you want to ask them what cultures that they belong to, you know? We do have a Afro-Latina population here in Fresno. We have very diverse individuals who come from all zip codes, and we just want to be mindful that you can't make any assumptions about the person who's sitting in front of you. And we want to be very clear that you want to ask that person specifically what kind of things that they are experiencing, what are those disparities that are happening, and what are the strengths? Because one of the things that we actually see in research is that specific to the African American, we're very deficit in our thinking. We assume that there's going to be problems. And I'll tell you from a personal perspective, one of the best things about me is that I'm Black, and that being a Black girl is like being in a secret club, right? And so it has been something that has been awesome for me. It's not all bad. It's something that's one of my strengths that I have that promotes my wellness. And I think that as long as we are talking to people from our community, you have to have a whole picture and look at both the strengths and disparities, you know, the things that we can work on. And so I want to ask each of you, just because we want to center this conversation on behavioral health and wellness, what kind of things would you say would be a recommendation as far as providing effective services to members of the Black community?
say one of the things that I've learned over time is that when I'm treating my Black clients, typically the episode of care tends to be shorter. It tends to be shorter. Like my Black clients, they don't stay coming back. Like they don't stay. And in research, that's labeled as Black clients tend to terminate treatment prematurely. And that is not always necessarily the case, which is why, number one, we need to be represented in research, because there's nobody who can better tell our story than us. So don't let somebody just come and research you and then interpret it for you and then put that out there. Different topic. But in terms of like just treatment episodes, like the length of treatment, my Black clients, they come, they get what they need, and then they're out the door. And I don't think that's necessarily always a bad thing. Some people will say like, well, they're just not acculturated to the therapeutic process. And they just didn't want to go deeper. When really, like, Black people are some of the most brilliant, resilient minds ever. Right. So if you can tap into that resilience, it doesn't always take a whole lot. It doesn't always take like a year of therapy. I've had some people come and get, 4 to 6 sessions and be like, you know what, I'm good. And it really transformed their lives. It can really transform their lives in the same way that someone else being in therapy for 2-3 years, in the way that's transformative. So really noting that you may not, when you get Black clients that come through the door, if you're expecting to see them a long period of time, just knowing that you may not, and it doesn't mean that, number one, you're not effective. It doesn't mean that they don't like you. It really means that you did your job to empower them to utilize their resilience to work toward wellness in their lives.
Absolutely. So trusting the individual that you're serving when they say that I'm good, right? And trusting them, I'm good, means I'm good. It doesn't mean that we're, what is the word that we like to use? Non-compliant, right? And just noting that a lot of times, I'll tell you, my grandmother thinks that behavioral health service is an assimilation tool. And it's taken many years to get her to understand that, like, for some people it's not, though. It's a source of support. And I think that she got those messages because for many years, behavioral health services came as a pathway from the legal system, for African Americans, is that in order to get your kids back or to stay out of jail, you have to participate in these services. So how willing am I going to be to participate in these services that are basically a punishment for me? So being mindful of that and trusting the individual that you're working with to say, I've gotten what I needed, thanks.
Yeah, and I just want to maybe just add to that. So, okay, so we all know African Americans, we are not trusting, individuals. So if I am walking into a room and that professional doesn't look like me, right? And I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to tell my story completely, right? Because I don't know if they're gonna listen or if they're going to understand me. So, and I think that that's really important. And then or even when you're seeking services, I think one of the questions, okay, so just making sure that provider will understand and what I believe in, what I am saying, my truth, right? And then how are you going to put that in a plan, right? That's going to help me, right? And so, and I think that I can say me, we have all of these, we're untrusting, we have all of these. When he walks in the room, close that door, we're on guard. Right. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to tell my true story to you. I got to get to know you a little bit better before I'm able to tell my story. So, and I don't know. It just seems like with African Americans it seems to me that's been like a real struggle in terms of behavioral health and seeking services and getting services there's not too many Dr. Thomases or Dr. Hamiltons that are here, in this community. And so I'm like so excited to meet both of you all. I'm already like, okay, I need to send some folks your way because it's so exciting to know that you all are here, in our community. Other than Big Mama and Reverend so-and-so, right? That there is some, trained professionals that look like me, that understand me, that can create a plan that's going to help me.
Well, Ms. Randall's hit it straight on the head. I'm not a doctor yet. I'm pursuing my doctorate degree right now, just a little bit longer, and I'll be able to join Dr. Thomas and Dr. White here soon, one of these days soon. But you hit it on the head. So the African American culture, the culture has there's a pervasive stigma attached to our culture. It has gone on for generations and generations, and rightly so. Because we've been lied to. We were under the premise at one time that we could get free medical care. If you do a little history and look up the Tuskegee experiment, you'll see that hundreds of men thought they were getting free medical care. And over 40 years, were being injected with syphilis and not getting the care that they needed. So to add to that, when treating this population, a lot of work will have to be done on the front end to establish a therapeutic relationship. You have to establish a relationship before you can go somewhere. So historically, the community has received services from the barbershop, from the beauty shop, from the church, or they talk to each other. And so they're not familiar. They need to be educated about services and what can be offered. Another key point is allowing this population to incorporate spirituality in their treatment plan because it will be used to help them with adversity when they deal with adversity. And, treatment will have to be exclusive and unique, and the individual receiving treatment will have to dictate what you can and can't do. So that's all I'll say about that.
Absolutely. And everything that you're saying is so relevant right now when we talk about COVID vaccinations, right? And African Americans being hesitant and reluctant about getting the vaccination. It's based in history, right? So we trusted the healthcare system and it ended up being something that killed a lot of us. So it's absolutely still relevant today. I'm sorry, Atisha.
No problem. He brought up a great point, and I was going to kind of segue into that as well, because there are several conversations. We've been having the conversations with the populations that are being served by our agency right now, where a lot of our African American clients are like, yeah, no, I'm not doing that. And they have all of this hesitation. And there are a lot of people that are not 100% understanding of it. And so I make it my purpose to make sure that I'm mentioning what happened with the individuals in Tuskegee, because a lot of people don't know about that. And so for me, it was very shocking because in my household and amongst other African Americans, that's the primary thing that we talked about when we talk about that pervasive distrust that we have is and it's kind of like the saying, like, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, shame on you. We all have that perspective when we're talking about seeking out therapeutic services. So a lot of times when individuals in the African American community, if they identify with the person and say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and give this a try, and they trust in the system that one time to go to that first session, those first 3 sessions, and if within that session they start to feel some of those stereotypes, some of that stigma, some of those microaggressions, the chances of them returning significantly decrease. And as their chances of returning significantly decrease, because we are all about community communication, yeah, we're going to go to the barbershop and someone's going to say, hey, I heard you went to a therapy session. How did that go? And they're like, yeah, no, I'm not going back. So this is what they did. This is what happened. It's not happening anymore. And it's not going to stop there because, again, it's that community communication. So the next person that's like, I got all this stuff going on, I'm thinking about therapy. They're like, oh, I wouldn't try that. I had a client that was here last week and this happened and things along those lines. And yes, we're getting that need met in with our nail technicians, with our the people in the salons and the barbers. Like, we're getting that need met, but it's important to make sure that it's happening in some other populations as well, and in this clinical setting. And so I also, talking about what Yolanda was saying, it's really important to have that relatability, and it's really unfortunate because there are so many times that even myself personally, when I first sought out therapy, is I didn't find anyone that looks like me. And so, yes, I have a woman who's sitting across from me. I'm like, okay, you know, you're meeting me halfway, but me opening up was very much a very slow process, because what that looks like is, okay, you're a woman, but you don't actually understand the experience of a Black woman. You don't understand I think it's toxic, but I think it's one of the tropes that's like, it's helpful but not helpful, of the strong Black woman identity, where we are supposed to not have depression, we are supposed to not have anxiety, we are supposed to pray the mental health symptoms away and just, you know, pray, take a shower, take an aspirin. And I say that because that's my mom's, her method. And, you know, hey, you know, you're not feeling good, take 2 aspirin, hop in the shower, you'll feel better after you wake up. And yeah, you know, as a child, you're like, okay, but that's more so in your mind. But as you grow up, you're like, okay, but then now what when the depression comes back? Now what when that anxiety comes back? There's also that embarrassment component. And so there's a lot of things that happen, and we just have to remember that, one, those first couple of sessions are going to be so essential when you are dealing with someone from the African-American population, because word of mouth is really important. It's similar to like when you find your beautician. I don't let everyone do my hair. So if I talk to Tiffany and Tiffany's like, oh, I have this great person, there's a high probability I'm going to the person that did her hair, because now I know that there is somebody that is going to take care of my hair, because I now have an example of what it's going to look like. It is the exact same way with therapy. If one person goes and has a great experience, they're going to tell people, and then there's going to be more people going. But if one person goes and that experience is stigmatizing and it's slightly traumatic, they're going to tell anyone that hears, and it's going to continue this community of not really seeking those services out. I think it's beautiful that we have a select few and we're moving more towards getting those things, but that pervasive distrust is always there. It's always at the back of our mind. So I may be open-minded, like, oh, you know, therapy, I had all this education, I know these things work, I'm a therapist, I work with my clients, I know all of this, but knowing and having that historical information is always going to conflict for me. So I'm like, yes, it worked, but also there's some really crappy people that do crappy things. And what if I run into that? I don't know. And that uncertainty and that unknown isn't going to push me in that direction 100%. I'm going to be less likely to go there.
Right. And one thing that I wanted to add, because this is so rich. Like, I love this conversation. In terms of, you know, being able to establish that rapport with Black clientele. And even as Black providers, sometimes both clients and providers can take it for granted that you're Black, I'm Black, so this is going to be an awesome fit. There are a lot of people who do not feel comfortable even sitting in front of a Black provider, because the assumption is, even in our training, it's a very Eurocentric model of training. When you're talking about working with diverse populations, the training teaches you to work as if the clinician is not Black, that the clinician is white. Like, when you're working with diverse populations, all the questions that you have to ask, the power dynamics to be mindful of. But when you're a Black provider, it's not always the same. Those dynamics can shift very dramatically. So the whole, you're Black, I'm Black, so it should be good. That is not always the case, especially when, you know, you have clients who are like, well, you were trained and I don't care. Like, it's just, you know, especially those who are, you know, those who are mandated, or their families like, look, go or else. They're thinking like, well, you're just going to use the same labels, you're going to use the same lingo, you're going to say the same thing if I were sitting across from a therapist who isn't Black. So really being mindful of that and not taking that for granted. And one of the things I do to really combat that, to kind of keep myself in check, is to not get into a semantic, like, you know, clinical argument with the client. If you don't call it anxiety, but you say your nerves are bad, that's fine. That is fine. I'm not going to argue with you about that. The fact of the matter is you're sitting right there in front of me. And when we talk about culturally tailored interventions and we talk about culturally relevant care, if you say, because I had a client say, like I, said, well, how long have you been feeling depressed? She had a very aversive reaction to that and was like, listen, I don't receive that. All I know is that I'm sad and I'm lonely a lot of the time and I can't sleep. And I'm like, okay, well, what can we do to help you not feel sad and lonely and just this emptiness? If your nerves are bad, what can we do to calm your nerves? So we have to be careful. And that's not just with Black clients, but any clients. Take their lead. If they say, I am not depressed, use their lingo. Now, of course, you can always be, full disclosure, informed consent. You can let them know, for billing purposes, this is what I'm going to call it, but here's what we call it here. And let's come up with a plan to calm your nerves or help you not feel sad. But getting in that intellectual, semantic, what do we call it? What do we categorize it? That's not going to work. It's just not going to work at all.
Dr. Thomas, you make such good points in that even the education we received as clinicians is from the perspective of dominant white society, right? And so I remember a specific time when I was taking the DSM class and learning about Alzheimer's, and I'm thinking, oh, so this is just when somebody is senile, right? It's like, because in my community, we call it senile. We don't call it Alzheimer's. And so again, just understanding that we have different words for different things, and that's okay, right? So we don't need to use the words that our dominant healthcare system uses, I think there's an opportunity to learn from each other and have that humility and grow and be the person that the individual you're serving needs. But I definitely think that both of you have said a lot of things that are super important. Tisha, I think we can have a whole other panel discussion on Black hair. I think that is something that is very unique to the Black community. Our hair is a whole conversation that we could have. I know that microaggressions is something that is linked to distrust, and I can remember a specific clinician telling me that one of their favorite Black clients left session and never came back after she complimented their wig. I think your wig looks really nice. And so, of course, I have so many follow-up questions. Was that a topic? Did she ever tell you it was a wig? No, but it was obvious. So it's like, where do I even begin with this whole conversation, right? It's like, do I say it? Are they open to receiving the feedback that I'm giving? Are we going to talk about that psychotic disorder diagnosis of delusional disorder because they've never personally dealt with law enforcement having any harm towards them, but they're fearful of it, they're fearful of their kids? Let's talk about that a little bit more, But again, I don't know that everyone is always open to hearing it and receiving it. And I think that that's one of the things that is unique to Black professionals in behavioral health is, number one, expecting us to be all cultural experts. We're not. If you want to learn about it, maybe do your own research before asking, unless someone offers to give you that education. And then number two, understanding that, there's a lot of things that are within normal limits for the Black community that aren't for other cultures. And that's, again, what Dr. Thomas says. That's not unique to the Black community. You have to do your research on the cultures that you're working with. And the first thing that you should do in assessment is there's a little page in the DSM called the Cultural Formulation Interview that a lot of people aren't aware of. Asking those questions about what cultures you align with, right? Their most salient identity may not be, it may be LGBTQ, it may not be Black, it may be something that's faith-based. So you don't know that until you talk to the person, get an understanding of what culture values they have, what wellness looks like in their culture, and then doing the research on your own. I think it's super important for providing those services. But again, as Tisha was saying, healthcare, and what Daryl was saying, healthcare has had a long history of providing barriers and just doing wrongs to the Black community. We have the Tuskegee event that happened, the experiment. We also have Henrietta Lacks, who is the reason that we have informed consent and HeLa cells that have cured things like polio. We have a whole bunch of things. You can buy them on the internet, but they didn't ask her to borrow her cells. In fact, they brought her family back and said like, hey, we want to do some tests on you to see if they had the immortal cells as well, and never called them back. And they lived in poverty up until 2016? And the HeLa cells are something that's $1 billion industry. And so just understanding that these are barriers for a lot of people. We tell these stories in our community. And so these are a lot of barriers. That distrust is something that is backed up by research, that distrust of providers. Even what Dr. Thomas said about, I'm not going to make an assumption. Yes, I'm lucky enough to have a Black provider who is providing me with services, but I still don't trust them, right? So doing that extra work to build rapport is going to be something that's super important. I do want to ask, just on the heels of that conversation, what recommendations would you have for non-Black service providers working with Black clients?
I think I would say acknowledging and kind of doing your own work on some of those unconscious biases. Because whether we like it or not, whether we're comfortable with saying it out loud, we all have them. We all have those unconscious biases that have kind of followed us through life, whether it was that one time someone cut in front of our parent and they said something as a child, and all of a sudden that is now the identity that we have placed on an entire community. And so being unconscious of what that is and how it plays a part in the way that we function in the world. So if I have an unconscious bias, there is going to be a high probability that I also have some unconscious behaviors and some nonverbal gestures that are going to go definitely in line with that. And being aware of that, because one thing that we want to make sure we're not doing is not giving our clients credit for reading us. Just like in a session or in an environment, we are reading those nonverbal gestures, we are reading into what they're not saying. They are doing the exact same thing for us. So if they're saying something, or their presence, or there's a topic that is 100% uncomfortable to you, they are going to be reading into the way that you're reacting to those things. And so being aware, acknowledging, and doing your own work, because acknowledgement and awareness isn't enough. So me knowing that this is my unconscious bias, me going, oh my gosh, okay, I acknowledge it, let me say it out loud, means absolutely nothing if I'm not identifying like, okay, when this happens, I do this. When that happens, I do this. So I need to be a little bit more aware of when this particular population is around me, or when this topic comes up, because there are going to be topics that are traumatic for African Americans. And more specifically to what's happening right now, let's talk about the police brutality and the high amount of African American, and more, I can get a little bit more specific, of like people of color that have been victims of police brutality. For a lot of people who have family members that are law enforcement, that can be your unconscious bias. Like, what are you talking about? That's not real. Because it's not real to you does not mean it is not real to the person that is there. And if any kind of thing about your unconscious bias and the way you respond to that shows them that you are 100% on board and acknowledging that this is something that's real for them, then they're no longer going to be interested in sharing that. So being able to acknowledge that, like, hey, this is a thing for me, and I'm working on it, and I'm being mindful of it, and I'm looking into it, and I'm doing my work with my therapist, I'm having the conversations with my friends, I am processing with my accountability person, whatever the case may be, being aware of that, because whether you know it or not, most of us are like, oh, you know, I got a hang of this, it's great, like no one knows. Yeah, we think no one knows. Similar to our clients when they come in and they're like, oh no, my life is totally manageable, everything's great, it's not falling apart. But then as you start to dissect things, they're like, oh, okay, well, maybe it's falling apart a little bit. But most of us, it's really good to like convince ourselves that we have it under control. Like I tell people all the time, like I am the biggest narcissist when it comes to things that I don't want to deal with. I'm like, I am an expert. I don't need therapy. I don't need this. And then I go to therapy and I'm like, oh, I felt so much better. I mean, okay, maybe I did need a little bit of therapy, but I can convince myself of anything. Like, you can't convince me, but I can lie to myself and believe it. And I'll have like an accountability person like Tiffany, like, okay, I mean, you believe that, but I don't believe that. And so we have to acknowledge that, yeah, we think we got it together, but sometimes we may falter, and keep that in mind as we are engaging with this population. Honestly, you should keep it in mind with everyone, but more specifically to this one, especially when there is that unconscious bias of if you have a family member that has said racist things or has engaged in stereotypical conversations and things along those lines, whether you want to acknowledge it or not, some of that is still with you, and you need to make sure that you're aware of it, because your clients are going to pick up on it. Myself as a peer, I usually pick up on it when someone says something microaggressive. I'm like, ooh, you didn't catch that part, but I did. And now I know how I'm going to engage with you moving forward. Because again, I have my own pervasive distrust. So the moment it comes out, there's no reeling that back in for me, because now I'm like, all right, noted, it's in the book. I'm going to keep that in mind every time we engage with one another. Our clients do the exact same thing. So just be mindful of that, because if not, you're setting yourself and your client up for failure.
Right. I definitely agree with that, especially about the unconscious bias. And just two really concrete things that I think is really important for providers, be it Black or otherwise, and working with your clients, be it Black or otherwise, because sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And I always say the most dangerous person is the person who doesn't know what they don't know. So when you're like, well, how do I know my unconscious biases? How do I even know when they come up? My barometer for me is when I'm shocked. When a client shocks me, when they tell me something and I'm like, I wasn't expecting that. I wasn't expecting that. That doesn't have to be centered on race. It could be centered on, cluster of symptoms, how, normal, depressed or anxious or traumatized people present. But either way, that comes from a bias. So number one, pay attention to when a client shocks you, when they say something that you didn't really expect at all. And then be aware of that and take a look at that. And then, like Tisha said, then check all your nonverbals too. But definitely do some processing on that. And secondly, if you know, and if you can feel that you're just kind of not connecting with, you're missing it with a client, because like Atisha was saying, the client knows and you should know too. And if you don't know, seek some consultation and supervision. Like if the client abruptly quits and you don't know why, and they never came back or not returning any follow-up calls, then it's time to do some consultation. But if you know that, you're missing them, it's okay to ask. Literally just ask. There's some times where clients stump me and I realize, and I can feel them getting frustrated, or I can feel them withdrawing or shutting down. And I just say, time out. You know what is it that you need right now? I feel like we're missing each other. Process comments, you can never go wrong with them, because it gives space for you guys to dialogue. And that's how relationship building works. That's how rapport building works. It gives you space to say, hey, what's going on here right now? And some providers are scared to do that because, like Atisha was saying, you're the expert in the room. Like, I'm the doctor in the room. I know what I'm doing. But really, it is okay to ask, and it's okay to own it. Now, what the client does with that is up to the client. But you at least have to give the client the choice. Like if I'm not good with this population, I'm just going to go ahead and ask. And if the client finds that off-putting and says, you know what, this is not a good fit, the client has that right. The client has that right. Let the client have the right to decide if you are the right provider for them at the right time. And it doesn't mean that, you're a bad clinician. They do exist, but it doesn't mean that you're a bad clinician. But let the client have the right to decide if this is a therapeutic alliance that is going to work for them. Because listen, we can't treat everybody. We don't get it right with everybody. And the moment we think we do, we fall into the bad clinician category. Because they do exist.
Don't be one.
Agreed. I'll also say that don't be in a hurry to diagnose anyone from this population. There is a reason why matched therapists will see less pathology than somebody from a different culture. And here's the deal with our population, with our culture, we are afraid of labels, are afraid of divulging information and being hospitalized, are afraid of being stuck with a label that will hurt us in the future. So those are all important things to keep in mind. Again, keep in mind that there will be mistrust. We have what is called cultural paranoia. It's a protective mechanism. It's a trait that will protect us. If we will not get comfortable in an environment that is unfamiliar, it ain't happening. If we want to know something about it, Tisha said earlier, we'll ask questions and we'll say something like, are there Black people there? Anybody look like me over there? Before we get comfortable with doing anything. Being sensitive, as Tisha said earlier, to oppression, because oppression will come up in a therapy session. People will get hurt. People will be discriminated against. People will feel that just because of the color of their skin, they didn't get something they had coming to them. I'll say don't view behaviors as deficient, but view them as different because we will cope in some crazy ways, right? And so that can be dealt with. Over time, dysfunctional coping strategies can be dealt with and fixed over time, but don't be alarmed by what you hear. Accept that. And then, Dr. Thomas said earlier, customize services for this population. Let them be in charge of what's going to happen with them.
Wow, this has been such a rich conversation. I'm actually learning a lot just, being on this panel. So we, in the work that we do here at West Fresno Family Resource Center, we're not licensed clinical, we're not a provider. Basically, we, folks come in, there's an assessment, and then we try to link families to services and resources that they may need. But there's something that, I hear a lot about, and I'd be curious to hear from the professionals on the panel about cultural competency, getting training, as a provider and cultural competency. And like who, you kind of hear that a lot, from folks. Are they trained? Have they received training in cultural competencies? I mean, are they going to be able to understand, all the different, races and things that are out there? So I'm not sure that is like important for a provider to have that type of training.
Yolanda, I want to ask you, what do you think about prevention and engagement for the African American community? You're kind of the expert on that.
Prevention and engagement?
Yes.
Wow, thank you for thinking that I'm an expert, but I can only speak about what my experiences have been, in our engagement, especially with our youth. We have this great program. It's funded through Mental Health Service Act. It's called the Sweet Potato Program, where we are engaging youth in resiliency and leadership and entrepreneurship and, college and ag training, kind of like all in one. And I think for these youth that we have in this program, we have 2 African-American male. They're actually leading the program. So to have these 2 young men, in this program, and to have, younger men, to have that opportunity for them to see these professionals, right, in their work, and having those great sidebar conversations with, and the staff comes back and they tell me, hey, I talked to this kid about, whatever the situation is. And then later on to get a phone call from that kid's mom to say, hey, this is what's going on. And can you talk to him about this? Or can you help us with that? So to get it from both sides, I think it's important. So when we talk about prevention, and I think I said this earlier, it's so important that we have people in our community that look like us, you know, that where a place where they can go and feel safe, that they can have those conversations, you know, and not worry about, you know, like the police knocking on their door or, you know, CPS, you know, knocking on their door, but really trying to get them the support and services that they need in order for them to be effective parents, in order for them to be a productive person, you know, in our community. So for me, I would say again, just having those professionals, having folks in their community, and then as far as the engagement, you know, listen. And I say this all the time, you know, those community engagements is great. You want to come in and you want to try to fix or try to help. But if there's not an early win, if there's not something where people can see that, hey, I came, I poured out my gut and I shared it with you. This was my concern and I want you to fix it. And if there's not an early win, you know, in the community, then it's folks are going to stop. They're going to stop showing up. They're going to stop participating because, oh yeah, I said that last time at the last focus group or at the last survey, I filled that out and nothing happened. So as far as engagement, listening, and then having some type of early win for folks in the community so that they can see that, yes, we heard you. And yes, we're going to try to work on whatever that particular issue is in your community. And here is something to show that we heard you, whatever that early win could be. And I know a lot of times, you know, the issues, the things that are in our community, it didn't happen overnight. These are years of neglect, you know, and it's probably going to take a long time to see some real changes in our community. But that early win, I think, especially now, is extremely important, you know, for our community.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. I think that that's something that is something that us as providers and organizations should keep in mind is that, you know, if we're listening to the community is one thing, but actually implementing change is a whole nother thing. And I think that there has to be a lot of that to build that trust, right? Just because of the historical significance. And so we got to do both listen and act. I think that's something that is very meaningful. I do want to switch it up a bit because we have talked about a lot of the importance of seeing the big picture. And so I want to ask each of you, what are some of the strengths that you've experienced as being a part of the Black community?
I would definitely say the resiliency. I think that there are a lot of things that happen on a day-to-day basis, whether we're talking about the whole thought process of what happens in this house stays in this house and how toxic that is and all of these different things that have taken place. I think I take a lot of pride in the level of resiliency, but also in our ability to reframe things. And so I say that because there are times when there is the most traumatic thing taking place and I'll have like one of my siblings or a friend who will make a joke about it. And yes, it's one of those things where you look back and you're like, that is really inappropriate. But because that's our way of dealing with that trauma, that's our coping skill, we're laughing and we're like, you know, it shouldn't be funny, but this is the only thing I can do. My option is I either laugh about this or I'm completely hysterical in tears. And for some reason, that middle ground doesn't really sit in our face for most of us. And so I like to look at that level of resiliency. So yeah, we'll come back and we'll address this incident and we'll say, you know, like, let me address it head on, let me deal with this. But we are 100% aware of what our history has been. And despite that history, we have still persevered. And I think that is one of those things where we can look back and say, you know, our ancestors were slaves. They were stolen from their homes. There's all these different things that we can look at. But yet here we are. There were marches. We have all of this history of people pushing back against the system and saying, you know, I matter. I exist. My existence is important. And when we look at a lot of oppressed individuals, there are times where it is so in your face that it's really hard to kind of stand up and say, you know, like, I need to fight back against this, because it's like everywhere you turn, there's just someone else has been killed, there's this going on, there's a high probability of different illnesses. And so we got all these things against us, and yet we still wake up every day. And yet we still can come in to work and say, you know, like, I saw something really traumatic this morning, but I can't allow that to dictate the way that I'm going to go about my day. A perfect example is unintentionally, I saw the George Floyd video. And for me, it was like, that was really rough to see, but I still had to go to work. I still had to see my clients. I still had to do that. And it's not just a me thing. It's one of those things where I was taught by my mom, and my mom was taught by her mom, that, you know, it's going to suck sometimes. You have no control over the fact that people are not going to like you for the color of your skin. You have no control over the fact that people aren't going to like you because you are darker than your siblings. And more specifically, when we talk about colorism within different communities and just colorism as a whole, you don't have control over whether or not those people are going to be accepting of you. You have control over the way that you respond to it and how you move through this life day to day. And that resiliency, even if it's one has a little bit of toxicity, it's still one of those things that, like, we still have to persevere. Like, we can't stop because we are constantly thinking about the people that come after us. When I come to work day to day, no matter what I'm encountering, and as I move up and as I go through my PhD program and as I do all of these different things that I'm doing, I'm always thinking about, look at the example I'm setting for my niece. Look at the example I'm setting for my nephews. When I was her age, I didn't think I could do any of this. I didn't have someone to look up and say, hey, you know, you could have a doctorate, you could have a master's. I didn't have that example for me. And so I think there's a level of carrying this big burden of who's watching me as I take these day-to-day steps, and what position am I holding for that, and walking tall with it. Because is it easy to do what I do? Do I falter? Of course. But I also look back and go, you know, I want my niece to know that it's okay to falter. It's okay to do this. It's okay to be frustrated that she, as a 10-year-old, is hearing about police brutality and learning more about these things than a 10-year-old should, because 10-year-old children should be allowed to be children, but it doesn't happen for African-American children. We are not seen as kids. Look at the way we are portrayed in media. They don't say this child, they'll say man. But we don't have that level of innocence attached to us. And so showing her that, like, it's okay to be innocent, it's okay to be a child, it's okay to falter, and carrying that along, as well as dealing with my own trauma of what I see day to day, what I deal with stereotypes, with microaggressions. And so I think that is such a beautiful thing. And whenever I have a moment and I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't do this anymore, I have to remind myself that, like, what are you talking about? You have all of this resilience. You have all of these people that are watching. You've gotten this far despite everything that has happened. You can't stop at this moment, because I know that someone's watching, and we may not always have that, but I, for a fact, know. And I'm like, my niece likes to acknowledge what I do all the time, so she's watching. So I can't stop here, because I need her to know that no matter what I encounter, I am resilient, and I'm going to push through this, and I'm going to do what I have to do.
Agreed. I would say another strength is strong family bonds. Strong family bonds. If you get an opportunity to do maybe some family work, or if you get an opportunity to get buy-in from mama or grandmama, then you got the client, because they'll listen to them before they listen to you. I'll also say, you know, that resiliency is a perfect example, because this culture there are overcomers. They are survivors. They will adapt. They will get through. They will make it happen. It doesn't matter what the cost is. You know, I think about soul food, and some of those delicacies come about as a means of survival, right? So this population will overcome, will adapt, will make it somehow, some way. And also, this culture is forgiving, despite all that's happened to us and our people and the people before us. The culture itself is forgiving. Doesn't mean that they don't forget, but they will forgive. So I'll let the others speak for the sake of time.
Wow, I was just, yeah, resiliency, strong family bond, that's so important, to our community. So I actually grew up pretty much in a single parent household. I have 8 brothers and sisters. My mom worked. So sometimes the meals were short, right? But my mom figured out a way, right, to make that meal stretch. I think there's a saying, make a way out of no way, right? And so that family bond and instilling that like in me and my brothers and sisters, like, okay, we may be short, but we're going to stretch it and we're going to make it work, right? And so then instilling that in my children, okay, you may be short, but look, this is what we're going to do in order for it to work. And so when I think about right now, when both of you were talking, I was thinking about my mom and this particular meal that she made. We hated it. We hated it growing up. But it was like everything in the kitchen, in the refrigerator, she threw together and we ate it. We hated it, right? But then when we got older, it was like, Mom, you don't make that dish anymore like you did when we were younger, right? And even now, we even try to struggle, like, what did she put in that? It was because it tastes so good, right? But that whole idea of making a way out of no way, the whole idea of resiliency, the whole idea of strong family bond, like that's who we are as African American or Black people. Like that is what is keeping us going, right? But I know maybe in some families they don't have that. They don't have that because we had talked about it earlier. The coping skills may not be, in the positive way, but somehow we're gonna have to change that, in our community. So.
I would say for me, and everybody on this panel has done it at some point, and probably one of my favorite things about the Black community is the ability to tell a story. The ability to tell a story. And I can't tell you how many times some of my best storytellers are my Black clients. Like sometimes I forget I'm a clinician and I'm like on the edge of my seat, like, word, what? Shut up. The ability to tell a story, because we're not just telling stories. We are talking about our identity. We're talking about our values. We're talking about legacy. We're talking about resilience. We're talking about what's right with the world, what's wrong with the world. And we do that all within the framework of a story in a way that other populations, I just don't see in other populations. Like we can tell a story and it feels like it's coming way out of left field. But by the time we are done with that story, like you feel like, pass the offering plate. It's time. Like altar call, somebody please. That's what it's like. We have the ability to tell a story. Even our comedians, like the best comedians are just really great storytellers. But just the Black community, that storytelling piece, and that the story is what's so transformative about the therapeutic process. If you can tap into a person's ability to tell a story and then be able to empower them to tell a story from a different perspective, to rewrite the ending, to do some character development, that's where the magic happens. That's what the therapeutic process is about, is the story, the narrative. And that's why I really just value my work with my Black clients, and then just being in the Black community. Do you see how everybody's leaning in right now, the way I'm talking right now and nodding and like, I'm saying something powerful, right? I'm not really, but it's the high context culture we come from. We use hand motions, we use our eyes, we lean in, we lean back, we smile. All of those things are really, 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 I think, powerful, a part of powerful communication in the Black community. And that's what I really, really love. I just love that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas, and thank you everybody for your feedback. I think that this has been so meaningful. I get the chills at times during this conversation just because of the synergy that's in this room, and I just want to highlight that each of you are doing something so impactful for our community, and we appreciate you so much. I think we need to continue this conversation and have it outside of Black History Month, right? Because we are accomplishing things all year. We are Black history has been made all year. It's not just during 1 month. And so this is something that we have to address, and we have to have these conversations because the disparities exist, right? We are still looking to achieve health equity, and this is something that we have to do that. And so this has been great. I want to thank each and every one of you for taking the time out of your day today to participate in this. If you all have any questions or any last statements that you want to say, we have 6 minutes, and I want to be respectful of your time. But if there's any last things that you want to say, now is the time.
I just want to say thank you to Fresno County Department of Behavioral Health for allowing this to happen. I do appreciate that this was possible. Thank you, Dr. White. I want to say it's a pleasure hanging out with the fellow panelists. I enjoyed this and it was fun. I look forward to doing or being a part of something like this in the future. And hopefully we can do more of these events outside of the month of February. For folks who work in the field, for people who need these services, or who would benefit from these services.
Yeah, and I would say the same thing too. Thank you all so much. It was a great opportunity to talk with you all. Thank you, Dr. White, for inviting me. I am just, I have learned right so much from being on this panel. And thank you again. And please, if there's anything in the future that you need support from, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Dr. White, for the opportunity. Thank you for coordinating us and sprinkling your Black girl magic, pixie dust on it. Very much appreciated.
And I'm just gonna, ditto everything that everyone else is saying. I am really appreciative, and thanks to my fellow panelists. I really enjoyed being able to have this dialogue with you guys. I think it's really important to make sure that we are making sure our perspective is a part of this conversation, not just in February. Again, all the time, we want to make sure that we have a voice in the room. And I think that this is a great component to make sure that we continue this conversation and it doesn't stop here. So I am really thankful for this, and thank you, DBH, for that. I really did enjoy this.
Thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate it. To continue the conversations, I want to welcome everyone, our audience, as well as our panelists, to attend our Cultural Humility Committees that happen the first Thursday of the month at 10 a.m. If you are interested in that, you can email me. You can visit our website. It's dbhequity.org. and find out more information. We have some resources there on racial trauma and healing. We have a variety of things about cultural responsiveness with COVID, and we have an amazing tech guy. I have to say thank you to Brian. He is amazing. I really appreciate this conversation. It's been very meaningful, and this has been great for my wellness personally. I'm about to text all of you after this because, my mom said when I told her to come on, who all gonna be there? Just like Daryl said, So I appreciate you all. Thank you so much for this. Have a great day.
Okay, great. Thank you.